Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second roundtable on liberty. The theme in focus for this discussion is human rights, and SFL is proud to host this event in collaboration with the Swatantrata Center of Hyderabad and ISEC Cochin. The Swatantrata Center is a social enterprise that aims at promoting choice and opportunity for all individuals to build a better and decent life with dignity. It envisions to build a peaceful and prosperous society by lifting the barriers to human flourishing. ISEC is an international youth-run, non-governmental and not-for-profit organization that provides young people with leadership development, cross-cultural internships, and global volunteer exchange experiences. The organization focuses on empowering young people to make a progressive social impact. Now, I would like to welcome the panelists for today's roundtable. Firstly, I would like to welcome Ms. Ayushi Agarwal. She is an alumnus of NLSIU Bangalore and Oxford University. She is a Wiedenfeld Hoffman Scholar and is currently a lecturer with the prestigious Jindal Global Law School. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Jerry Johnson. He holds a master's degree in HR from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. He's currently a faculty with iPolicy, the public policy program of the Center for Civil Society. He's also a guest speaker with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Welcome, sir. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Bhavani Fonseka. She is an alumnus of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and the University of Denver. She has more than 15 years of experience as a constitutional and human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka. She currently holds the position of a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Apoorva Bose. She is an alumnus of NUALS Kochi and holds a master's degree from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva. She has worked as a legislative assistant to MP Haibi Eden at the Lok Sabha and currently works as a human rights lawyer based in Cochin. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Katherine Mangu-Ward. She is the editor-in-chief of Reason and oversees all of Reason's print, digital, and video journalism. Her writing has found place in eminent publications like the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. She is a graduate from the Yale University, from where she received her bachelor's degree in philosophy and political science. She currently lives in Washington, D.C. Lastly, but not the least, I would like to invite the moderator, Ms. Atishya Kumar. She's an alumnus of NUALS Kochi and the University of Nottingham. She is currently a junior research consultant with the National Human Rights Commission. I would like to hand over the floor to you, ma'am.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Nitika. So before we begin, I'll just give a short introduction to what we are trying to do today. As I'm sure all of you are aware, this is the time where human rights violations has almost been at its peak. So which is why webinars like these are extremely important to discuss, not just amongst the students, but also amongst different stakeholders about what the violations have been and how we can move and what the future responses should be. Because during the pandemic, as I'm sure you're aware, there have been various problems that have emerged, and in our society, the inequalities that had already existed have exasperated. So from literally the women's gender-based violence that women have faced being called the shadow pandemic, to the transgenders being completely out of job, transgender persons completely out of job. We have seen also at this time that in India especially, that freedom of speech and expression has taken a major hit, with the dissenters being engaged and UAPA being charged with UAPA. So with all of these violations and all of these problems emerging one after the other, webinars like these become extremely important to discuss and try to come to some sort of recommendatory it has to be some sort of recommendatory outcome, so that we can try to put all of these things not just in talking, but in action. And as all of us work in different parts of the different parts of government and other stakeholders like civil society organizations, it is on us and all the young lawyers that are present today and all the other people who are present today in this webinar to actually do something about these problems and not just talk about them like we do in these webinars. So hopefully we'll come up with brilliant recommendations at the end of it. And now I will start with the first speaker. Please keep the time limit in mind because we have a very strict schedule. It's 8 minutes. Let's not try to go overboard because there is another webinar that is being conducted after this. So we will start with Ayushi, who's going to be talking about women's rights, especially, and human rights in general. So Ayushi, over to you now.
Hi, thanks a lot, Atishya, and good evening to all my colleagues here, and especially the South Asia Students for Liberty. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Go ahead.
All right. Atishya, am I audible to you? Because you were shaking your head. Okay, I'll start, and I hope Atishya will be able to fix the audio problem. So, as Atishya pointed out, this is a grave pandemic, and the pandemic has evolved into many different kinds of pandemics, and one of those is the pandemic of domestic violence. I'm going to discuss my recent research on how women's liberties have been adversely impacted due to this lockdown, resulting in what many academics now are calling the shadow pandemic of domestic violence. So we have seen that there has been a lot of emphasis on staying home to stay safe. And this slogan has been repeated by governments around the world to make sure that people reduce the transmission of COVID-19. But this slogan excludes the reality of those people for whom the home is actually the most dangerous place to be. And these people are the victims of domestic violence. We know that gender relations are unequal in society, but they are even more unequal often at home. And for people who are in positions of power who disproportionately tend to be male, whether in the legislature, in the judiciary, or the executive, it is often an easy as well as a convenient assumption that everything at home is fine and that the home cannot be a dangerous place to be. And we see how this is reflected in how India's judiciary as well as legislature has approached personal laws, keeping a safe distance from antagonizing people, and obviously in the process sacrificing on equality often. Let's look at some data. So the National Crime Records Bureau released data, and in 2018, we saw that the crimes against women, the category that received the highest numbers was cruelty by the husband or his relatives. And the frequency of this crime was in fact once every 5 minutes, which only goes to show how false the premise that the home is a safe place to be is. And let's keep in mind that not all victims actually even report in the first place due to a plethora of reasons. So why is this so important, especially now? It's because it shows that the policy is incomplete and the policy is unaware of the reality within the home. And in doing so, it erases the reality of the victims, and effectively it locks them in with their abusers, which is the worst position that you could put a victim in. But more so, it also completely fails to account for how the lockdown itself has exacerbated domestic violence. And there are many factors for this. The first one is that research has shown that isolation as well as financial strain can aggravate the tendency to use violence as a means of release. And we're all well aware that the lockdown has resulted in loss of jobs, introduction of salaries, in adverse changes at the workplace. And that built up frustration is now being manifested in more and more domestic violence. Secondly, the buffer that women often had between such violence and their safety at home was the fact that they were the breadwinners, they were bringing income home. But due to structural inequality, women also tend to be employed in the front lines of disposable jobs. And many of them have been the first ones to actually be kicked out of their jobs and to lose the income that was their only bargaining power against the violence at home. And lastly, the reason that this lockdown has exacerbated domestic violence or the effects of domestic violence is because it has made an escape from it next to impossible. Whereas women could earlier escape to the homes of their relatives, their friends, their parents, that is almost impossible given the current mobility restrictions. And we also have to bear in mind that those who are worst affected by this are those who are vulnerable, not just in terms of their gender, but even in many other ways. So those who are in the lower strata of the socio-economic ladder in our society experience also situations. And if we see the data that the National Commission for Women has recorded, we can see that domestic violence cases have more than quadrupled ever since the lockdown began in India. And eventually, there has also been a record that says that there have been, that this data is the highest in 10 years. And again, I'd like to point out that given this, we still know that this is underrepresentative of the real gamut of the problem, because many victims do not have a safe space at home from where they could make that one phone call talking about what's happening to them. Many of them do not have a device, either a mobile or a laptop with internet connection through which they could register a complaint. And even more importantly, perhaps, many women do not consider what is happening to them as domestic violence, because there is this general notion that domestic violence means that a woman must bleed, that she must have bruises to show for the violence. But according to the legislation on domestic violence in India, it is not just physical violence, it is also emotional trauma. And the increasing caregiving responsibilities that women have now without any space in the day to even breathe a sigh of relief does result in emotional trauma, which many women do not really perceive as domestic violence, even though it is. So given this, what should the government ideally be doing? Well, before I go on to what the Indian government has done, I want to point out that this is not something that's happening solely in India. This phenomenon of rising domestic violence cases has been experienced all around the world, from Brazil to Spain, Italy, UK, China. And governments have adopted novel measures to address it, which range from declaring domestic violence to be in the category of an essential service requiring immediate police response, to evolving secretive modes of communication, such as women going to a pharmacist and saying a particular code word, which alerts the pharmacist that this woman is in distress, and they even making the hotel rooms that are currently abandoned available for these victims as shelter homes. However, when we talk about the Indian government, what we see is that they are not only in denial of the problem, but they're also completely disinterested. So Smriti Irani, who is one of our three cabinet ministers, has gone on record to say, one of our three female cabinet ministers, has gone on record to say that the problem of increasing domestic violence simply does not exist. And this is despite the fact that we have data to show that it is at a 10-year high. And even though our Prime Minister regularly addresses the nation in live conversations and frequently through tweets, this problem has never, ever been mentioned, even by him. And this is just measures that don't even require any resources. But when it comes to resource, the response is even worse, because even though the link between alcohol consumption and the link and the consequent increase in domestic violence is proven, still, when India made its decision on allowing the sale of alcohol once again during the lockdown, there was absolutely no consultation on the matter of domestic violence. It was simply not taken into account that men will now have access to alcohol while being at home and being in a state where they're likely to perpetrate even more violence. So the point is this, essentially, this is a grave situation. Of course, governments are under immense pressure to reduce the spread of COVID-19. However, any policy measure that fails to account for the realities of gender relations at home is going to be a half measure. And the problem is not with the lockdown. It is perhaps necessary, but the problem is with the policymaker who does not want to account for the experiences of the women. And in doing so, it only makes the problem much worse for an already disadvantaged community. So with that, I'd like to end my bit for this seminar, and I hope there'll be some interesting questions that I can answer in the follow-up session.
Thank you for that, Ayushi. That was extremely required for people to understand why this is happening, especially during the lockdown. And now we will move on to our second speaker, who is Jerry Johnson, and he will be speaking about LGBTQ plus their rights and the effect of COVID-19 because of the lockdown on LGBTQ plus community. Over to you, Jerry.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Cool. Good day, good evening, good morning to everyone from various parts of the world joining in. It's an amazing attendance, an amazing gathering. The topic we're discussing, actually, before I begin my little spiel, Nitik, I just want to make a little correction in your introduction of me, just for the sake of factual accuracy. I do not have a master's from TIS, so let's just get that out of the way, but that's all right. Let's address the issue at hand. We're having a roundtable conversation on human rights, and each of us have like 8 minutes to talk about human rights, and that's just an impossible task. The conversation about rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and various other diversity segments is such a complex topic that we can only have very broad-based, touching upon it in a very broad-based manner. So I'd like to first step back and ask, what are the kinds of vocabularies we use to talk about human rights to begin with? So in this audience, there are so many of us from various parts of the world, but you will notice that pretty much all our conversation and all the vocabulary on rights and on our human rights are things that we have borrowed from the West. And I think this is the first thing we have to first accept, acknowledge, and realize. We often undermine the role that culture and psychology play in our interactions with each other in society. And what are rights? Rights are essentially the rules that govern the interactions of people in society. So if you want to have certain kinds of rights that are universally accepted, imbibed, and immersed into the soul of human beings across the world, you have to do either two things. One, you have to assume that all human beings all over the world are the same, that all our psychologies are the same, or you have to impose upon it, top down, push it down, enforce rights, which let me not be the one to tell you this in this audience, that the second option sounds very contradictory to the whole concept of rights, right? So for us to be able to engender a respect for rights or a desire to live with rights with each other in society, it has to become part of our culture, part of our psychology. It's kind of like going to church, right? You can go to church, fold your hands, close your eyes, kneel. That does not mean you are a devout person, that you are a religious person. I have no idea about your soul, your heart, your mind, whether it is in the place to worship God. And that is the notion with rights. Therefore, if you notice, you will have India and East Asian countries really struggling with the concept of rights. Why? We struggle a lot more with the concept of rights because historically, culturally, our cultures are drenched with ideas of hierarchies, diversity, differences. We've got 5,000 years of history of caste. And in just like 60 to 70 years of Indian independence, you are expecting that 5,000 years of baggage to disappear. And that's not going to be an easy job, right? So we have a history of hierarchies, of caste, of difference and diversity. That is the culture we are soaked in. And in this milieu, we have to have a conversation of equality, in this conversation of human rights, all equal under the law. And that's going to be an uphill task. Now, the flip side of it is the West has had great historical familiarity with the concept of rights and equality. You know what they struggle with, however? They struggle with diversity. I mean, I don't have to tell you what's happening in the news, right? There's so much of struggle with the difference, the foreigner that's entering my country, this person that looks different from me, this person of the other race. I can't deal with this difference. The West is struggling with diversity, struggling with difference. At best, their understanding of diversity is tokenism. You put a few colorful people on a brochure and you've got diversity. And I mean, I think that is not the understanding of diversity, right? The diversity goes far more deeper. What is the understanding of diversity? It is a deep sense of understanding your location in the system you have created. Why do we say a person has privilege? We say a person has privilege because that person's identity, whatever that may be, is germane to the system that that person has created. It is part of the system that the person has created. The fish is in water and does not realize that the fish is wet. It only takes someone outside to come in and realize this system doesn't work for me. That's difference, that's diversity, that's race, that's immigration. That's all of those conversations that the West is struggling with. We have had 5,000 years of all kinds of people coming in, going out, all kinds. North India is different from South India, is different from East India, is different from West India. We have hundreds and hundreds of languages, hundreds and hundreds of rituals, but we don't know how to treat each other equally. We struggle with treating each other as equals. We are very good with entitlement. We are very good with talking down to others, and we have a great sense of our own sense of importance. So in order to have a conversation about rights in India, you have to inherit the vocabulary that Indians are familiar with the most. And for that, you have to go really down to the evolutionary roots, right? How does our psychology work? We are a culture that you can't say we are collectivist, you can't say we are individualist, right? And in a culture that is really strongly bound to family, but not to society, strongly bound to our little communities, our kins, our caste, but not to nationhood, the conversation is very different from trying to say that we should have rights across the country all equally. And so therefore the conversation here has to be about, okay, the price of you being different has to be paid. What do I mean by that? If you want to live the way you want to live, you have to pay a price for it. And what is that price? What is the currency that you make that payment in? You make that payment in the currency of liberty, in the currency of another person's rights. And this is the trade and exchange conversation that we need to have here. So when we're talking about free speech, right? So we're always saying, yes, free speech should be guaranteed. Everybody, I mean, all of us kind of sort of agree, I'm hoping, that free speech is a nice and fundamental right. But how do you use a vocabulary familiar to a culture here about free speech, right? So here the vocabulary has to be different. It has to be, how am I going to determine my life and my journey, my self-determination, my journey through life? How can I have that? How can I protect that without imposing upon yours? So I, as a gay man, for example, will I have the literature about gay rights, gay health, LGBTQ health, mental health that I need to survive as a gay man? And this is a conversation we should have in our culture. So if you, I'll just give you an example. More than 3,000 years ago in India, we had Jain monks who wrote about how the physical body can be different from the psychological body, can be different from the expressive body. So this is 3,000 years ago. Jain monks are watching and observing that there is something different about humans. There is a body that they present with, there is something that they feel internally, and there is something that they act out externally. This is modern, this is what in modern times is called gender studies, right? So if we use a vocabulary that we are familiar with, saying that, okay, in our culture, my body and my feeling and my expression comes out this way, and there is something called anekantavada, there is something called multiplicity of ways in which we see the world, that there is no one way in which you can see the world, then can you allow me to see my world and my journey and go my way? And how can we negotiate our different journeys and our differences without imposing or without restricting each other? So here the conversation has to always be negotiation, because when two different people meet, the negotiation has to be either one based on conflict and one that wins over control over the other, or that both agree and both move on. So these conversations are very complex.
I'm so sorry, Jerry, but we have run out of time. So could you please wrap up in like next 10 seconds?
I actually just finished giving my speech, because as I said, this topic is so vast and I can go on for 3 hours. So I'll just take over the questions afterwards.
Hopefully we'll have time for questions and then you can complete what you were saying. So now we are going to move on to our next speaker, which is, I am not sure how to pronounce her name, but I'm hoping it's Bhavani or Bhavani, I'm not sure. But let's hear from her about Sri Lanka and human rights.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you, and thank you for the invite, and it's good to see so many logged into this event. I mean, as Jerry mentioned, look, in 8 minutes, it's going to be impossible to even scratch the surface, and I think you've kind of thrown that impossible task at us, but I'm going to just flag some of the key issues that would be interesting for the audience, and I think most of the audience is Indian, so I think I'm in the minority here in terms of Sri Lankan. I won't make any assumptions, but I'll just kind of flag some of the key issues, but also try to show some of the strategies that have been used as civil society lawyers in Sri Lanka encountering various multiple challenges over the years in terms of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. So very quickly, in terms of Sri Lanka, look, we've had decades of violence and we had a near 3-decade war. The war ended 11 years ago in 2009, so we are still in a post-war situation. But in that 11 years, we have had challenges such as authoritarian regime, threats to human rights, threats to the rule of law. We had a constitutional coup in 2008, and as civil society lawyers, we were in court and challenging that. Then we had a very unfortunate reminder of the fragility of our peace in 2019 with the Easter Sunday attacks, which cost hundreds of lives in Sri Lanka. And most recently, we had the COVID challenges. So all of these issues, in a way, one can spend a few days discussing. So in 8 minutes, I would just kind of think about what are the key challenges we face. And I think those are global challenges in many respects. Very strong leaders being elected to government. So Sri Lanka, we've had, luckily, elections, democratic elections, franchise. So people have gone and chosen their leaders. And unfortunately, due to political reasons, geopolitics, all of that, some of these elections have seen strong leaders, authoritarian regimes coming in. So in that, it has had huge implications on human rights, on the rule of law, on democracy. And for locals who are fighting this, who are trying to resist and be resilient, these are constant reminders that populist leaders come in with a mandate. A lot of the times they justify certain policies, practices on saying they were elected to office to carry certain things. So that adds an extra challenge when one has to protect, promote, uphold human rights. So we, in the last 11 years, looking at just the post-war situation, have had so many issues that have been, in a way, out of our control. But those challenges have also tested the ability to be able to organize, to be able to document, to be able to challenge. So I'm a practicing lawyer in Sri Lanka. And as lawyers, what we do is we try to go to court. And we try to use the court, the legal system, to uphold these rights. But what is difficult, and many of you know as lawyers or having studied judgments, is that it's not always a very straightforward issue. When you have politicized institutions, when you have the core fundamental issue of the judiciary having political appointments or interference, there is a huge issue in terms of looking to an institution for relief. So there is that dimension in terms of trying to use the court system. But what we have done over the years, and I'm trying to make it a very practical thing, is using courts, using public interest litigation, strategic litigation, to keep issues alive. So we may not always have a court victory, but I think as young lawyers, people interested in how to keep pushing, I think one needs to realize it's not always a court victory in terms of a court win, but a victory can mean that you get attention on an issue. You use different legal
I think Ms. Bhavani is facing some technical issues.
public interest.
Facing some technical issues.
Sorry, I don't know where I missed you, but I seem to have lost signal. But look, I don't have a lot of time, but what I'm trying to say is that one has to be creative in terms of thinking through strategies. But when one thinks about these challenges, and just looking at the last few months, couple of challenges that were thrown at us so quite intensively is we had to deal with having no parliament. So we had a very strong executive president deciding action. We had courts shut down because of COVID. We were under a lockdown where legally we raised questions. We had media, lawyers who were critical being arrested, detained, and questions of due process. So when all of these things are happening, plus we had the issues of profiling of minorities, we had targeting of different critiques, the opposition being very, very weak. We had a whole set of challenges. And when you're stuck at home, the choices are very, very limited. But then you go back to lessons in terms of what we did during the war. And during the war, I mean, as many in South Asia would attest to, we have become resilient having faced cycles of violence, cycles of authoritarian regimes, cycles of having to be creative in how we work. So one of the things we've did very early on is set up ways of communication. Because we take these Zoom and webinars for granted, but just as what happened now, you can lose coverage, you can get completely shut down, you can be isolated. So then you find creative ways of trying to not rely on the same modes of communication. Difficult, but there are ways we used to communicate during the war years, when there was no electricity, when there was no internet. Using a landline, for example, which can be a bit of a surprise sometimes, as we are used to social media so much. But using different creative ways of communication, I think, is very important. Remembering that this is the long game. You're not going to get immediate results. So one of the things I keep thinking, and we are now next week going to be in the Supreme Court challenging the latest constitutional challenge this government has thrown at us, which is a consolidating of the executive presidency, is that we are not going to have an easy, quick win. These are sometimes months, years, decades. So think strategically. You need to think of ways of sustaining yourself. Who are your support systems? Are there local support systems? Are there regional support systems? So one of the things that I'm impressed with this kind of group is you have different individuals, young people coming together and finding ways of working together. And one of the things we do is we look to India. We look to your case law. We look to your judicial thinking, and we use that. So are there people in this group that can work together in terms of your own battles? And I might tap into some of you all as well, because I was told there are a lot of young lawyers or law students here. How does one work together? And not today, tomorrow, but in the next couple of months. And how do you keep those engagements? And lastly, I know time is up, is have a plan in terms of the misinformation, the fake news that's going to come, the attacks that one is going to face. Personally, we faced a lot of attacks. We've also had a lot of, when you're trying to fight a case, you also have a lot of misinformation thrown at you. Who can do that? So in a way, planning as much as possible, but having a team that you can rely on, a team that is different, different strengths and different perspectives as well.
I'm so sorry, I have to stop you there. But thank you for touching upon so many relevant issues, which are not just a part of Sri Lankan problem, but also all over the world. So moving on from that, I would now request Apoorva to take the floor and enlighten us with rule of law.
Thank you, Atishya, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor. And to be amidst such august company, it's truly a privilege. And so I would basically be talking about rule of law and human rights and the connection between the two, which is quite obvious. And again, this is such a broad topic, so to narrow it down would be quite a task, but I'll try doing my best. So, when you talk about rule of law, it's of course not alien to all of us. And it can be traced back to the times of Aristotle, and so many thinkers, even of this century, like Rawls, etc., have spoken about it quite extensively. But it's only until recently that the human rights movement paid relatively, in the past, it did not really, human rights movement did not really talk about rule of law quite explicitly. So UDHR, of course, mentioned rule of law only in passing in the preamble. And at the same time, when you look at treaties, General Assembly statements, etc., the concept of rule of law is not explicitly mentioned. But of late, the reference to rule of law has increased substantially when you look at reports, resolutions, etc., etc. So when you talk about rule of law, I basically see this as a door that opens up to human rights, and it's integral to the human rights movement. So one of the classes I took during my master's was called Rescuing Human Rights, and it was loosely inspired by one of the books written by Hurst Hannum called Rescuing Human Rights itself. So human rights. So when we talk about rescuing human rights, like, does it really need rescuing, and who is actually going to rescue it? That was one of the topics that we discussed in the class. And in one of the classes, we actually spoke about how rule of law can actually be one of the rescuers. And I will basically talk about this, in the brief time that I have. So when you talk about human rights movement, there is a lot of conversations today about this, and we also live in something called the post-human rights world, according to some. So, and when you talk about the criticisms, faced by human rights movement, one of the main criticisms that we see is that it is Eurocentric in nature. And that's actually spoken by my peers before this, and being in Geneva and being a part of a lot of conversations, most of the times what I observe is the fact that you completely leave out global south in these conversations. And most of the academicians, the thinkers, etc., are from this part of the town, this part of the world, which is the global north. So that is one of the main criticisms that we see when we talk about human rights movement. The second one is, of course, the fact that it is male-centric in nature. So these are the two main criticisms that we see often and we discuss often in vacuum. So women's rights movements have among the most contentions of all human rights issues, as evidenced by a number of reservations to key provisions in CEDAW. So when we talk about rescuing human rights, the ambit of rule of law in this aspect has also expanded over the years. So an academic inquiry, of course, reveals that, it to be a contentious principle. And there are various meanings and usages associated with it in both legal and political philosophy. And when we talk about rule of law, of course, we have to talk about the two different schools of thought or two different aspects of it, one which is the formal and the other which is the substantive. And the main issue with something like this is the fact that it's highly dependent on the lens through which we look at these concepts, because both of these definitions are subject to debate and the essence and importance of it is never undermined. So one of the things that we constantly ask ourselves is that whether rule of law can help foster equity and social justice. And the substantively, when we talk about this, the development redistributive model of rule of law has two main planks. And the first is an international dimension that highlights the radical disparity between North and South, which of course talks about right to development, the debt forgiveness, etc., etc. And the other one is the domestic aspect of it, where we reflect the particular circumstances of each state. So these are the two different lenses through which we look at the concept of development redistributive model of rule of law. And the second concept is the fact that most states of the global south, when they look at rule of law and or when they look at financial institutions like World Bank and IMF, which essentially talks about rule of law and strengthening rule of law, it is often seen as a form of economic, cultural, political, and legal hegemony. And of course, the next part of it is the fact that there are dangers of abuse of powers and how rule of law does not adhere to all the areas that we're talking about right now. Like, for example, the key issue that we face is the famous American exceptionalism. So US has not, of course, ratified CEDAW and various other conventions and treaties. But what happens is when we look at the US, the failure of the international law to restrain US power, or at least to cabinet with an institutional context of, normal politics, demonstrates the limits of rule of law in itself. So most of the times when we talk about rule of law, it becomes more like a overused term or a rhetoric in the sense. So there is a great danger in promising too much in the name of rule of law. And so it's important not to be disillusioned by this concept and to understand the good things that can come out of this concept and not overpromise. Another obstacle to rule of law, strengthening rule of law, is the political processes. So member states often count on the UN to strengthen human rights by following rule of law. And this can actually not be convenient for politicians. So one of the main criticisms of the rule of law is the fact that, most of the time, there is no political willingness to follow this. And sometimes it has very little to do with the law itself, but it depends on, who regulates these laws. So politically also there must be willingness to actually strengthen rule of law as well. And the next thing is the fact that most of the times what happens is we focus on formal institutions and we forget the fact that to strengthen rule of law and thereby strengthening human rights, it's important to look at other institutions as well, non-informal institutions as well. And most of the times in most countries, corporate powers also pose a threat to strengthening human rights and also strengthening rule of law as well. So when we talk about rule of law, we often talk about rights. And we forget that there's an other aspect to it, which is access to these rights. So there needs to be a confluence of both formal institutions as well as informal institutions working together in order to ensure that people can seek these rights and human rights is thereby strengthened. So in an Indian context of things, rule of law is absent in the text of India's constitution, but at the same time, it has been mentioned extensively in various case laws, and it is actually a concept that's often overused in India. One can of course conclude that the principle of rule of law is embedded in India, but is it actually present in today's in today's India, or is it just a concept that we overuse and just talk about in vacuum? So over the past, when you look at like various
I'm sorry, Apoorva, but I have to stop you there because the time's up and we have to give the floor to Katherine. But thank you for that international perspective of rule of law and bringing in not just the Indian, but the overall global concept of it. So Katherine, over to you now. And she'll be talking about freedom of speech and expression in the US context.
Thank you so much. I'm just absolutely delighted to join you all. I'm sorry we're not able to be physically together because I think there's a real power in gathering people who share the principles of liberty, especially people from many different countries, from many different places. I'm a longtime participant in and student and supporter of Students for Liberty, and I know that India has a particularly strong contingent. So I'm very, very sorry not to be able to be with you. One thing that I've been thinking about as I was preparing these remarks is that in the US, free speech, it's our first right. It's the first one on the list. And we make a big deal about that here. It's our First Amendment. And it's sort of the fundamental human right in many ways, the one without which all others are lost. But in that same First Amendment is the right to assemble. And I think that particularly under COVID-19, under billions of people who have basically had that right to assemble abridged, have been told, for good reasons, for real, in the face of real concerns, that they cannot leave their homes and assemble to speak. That really highlights the importance of the speech itself and the different platforms on which one might speak. So as I'm thinking about free speech and how it sort of enables and facilitates other human rights, I want to not lose sight of the idea of assembly and gathering and the ways in which those rights are being abridged for everyone around the world in so many ways. Under COVID-19, online and digital speech has become more important than ever here in the US. I'm a magazine editor, and one thing that we've sort of joked about, though it's very dark humor, is to say that COVID-19 has been very good for business for us. We have gotten a lot more traffic. We have gotten a lot more readers. It's because I think people are desperate for good information, for a way to understand what's going on in the world right now. And we all use different platforms, both to push out our speech and to participate in political speech. I was really struck by Bhavani's exhortation to be resourceful about the ways in which we speak. You sort of said, you might even need to call someone on a landline phone, which is, both sort of, it's a funny thing to think about, but also a very serious thing to think about that we are used to, especially in the US. We are used to having a very, very large number of platforms to promote the things that we think, the things that we want to say, but that in fact, like those modes of speech are under assault. So that's what I want to talk about just a little bit here in my time. you know, the power of free speech is largely in holding people who are powerful accountable. That is what free speech is for. And you know, when we say that, it can mean very different things in very different contexts. And so sometimes the powerful are governors, the state, the people who hold political power, but sometimes they're people who hold cultural power. And this is, I think, something that in the US we're really struggling with right now, and that people are struggling with around the world, which is that, you know, to have truly free speech, you also need a culture of free speech, that we can spend a lot of time fighting about legal protections for speech, and we should, because they're vital, but that at the same time, you also need kind of cultural context and space for diverse opinions and views. And, you know, this is what we mean by toleration and pluralism. It's actually not praiseworthy to let someone you agree with speak. That's not hard. Anyone can do that. What's difficult is to let someone you disagree with speak, even if you think the stakes are very high, even if you think the stakes are life and death. And that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and defending at Reason Magazine. You know, journalists in particular can really be under threat, both, again, from state actors, but also from extra state actors, from people who do not hold political power, but who can nonetheless threaten them with violence. I know there are many brave Indian journalists who have died doing their work. There are journalists around the world who have died doing their work, or who have suffered in the defense of both reporting and then sharing what they have discovered with the world. And that is always kind of the bedrock of any other fight for civil rights or for human rights. People have to know what's going on. They need to know the truth about the world around them before they can even begin to build on that and to defend civil rights and human rights that are so important to their well-being. I have a sort of, I guess, just on a kind of a closing note, we have a thing that we say here in the United States, maybe people say it elsewhere too, I don't know. We're going into an election season. It's about time to vote around here. And people often say, if you don't vote, you can't complain. And regardless of what you think about the importance of voting, the thing that I want to close with is that is the most wrong-headed way to think about free speech and about political action. If you don't vote, you can still complain, and you should. The most important civic act can be to complain about the failures of your leaders. And in some places, that complaining is recreational. You do it sitting around, relaxing with your friends. It's a lighthearted pursuit. And in some places, complaining about your leaders is to take your life in your hands. And it's deadly serious and dangerous. And I think, you know, it's important to see political speech on that full spectrum, that it should be participated in as a leisure activity, as a fun activity, as an activity for self-development, but that we should never lose sight of the fact that people are also engaging in political speech at great risk to themselves, and that to defend that protection for speech, to create in our sense of what rule of law requires, in our sense of what a free society requires, a large, noisy, sometimes terrifying space for speech. That to me is the place that you have to start with any defense of a free society of civil liberties. And I see that as my role as a journalist. I hope that you all will sort of join me in defending a free press. I know that you do, otherwise you wouldn't be here on Saturday with this incredible group. And I hope that, you know, the next time this conference happens, we can gather together and speak together as a group, as a global community.
Thank you for that, Katherine. It was definitely interesting to hear about freedom of speech and especially press in US, and understand the different perspectives, because we don't exactly have freedom of press as part of our constitution in India. It's inculcated in Article 19. So it's part of just the general freedom of speech that everybody has. So we don't have specifically anything known as freedom of press here. But recently we've heard a lot about fake news, and even Bhavani spoke about it. So maybe we can start the roundtable discussion with something regarding freedom of speech and fake news and human rights and all of these, and how all of these are they all have conflicting human rights, but at the same time, they're equally important to protect the freedom of speech. So despite the fact that we have a large case of fake news, especially right now in all parts of the world, how that relates to freedom of speech and expression and freedom of press. So I would open the floor first to Bhavani, because she talked about fake news at the very end, and she can continue from there, and then maybe we can move on to Katherine.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So we were thinking of like not exactly having questions as of now, just sort of a panel discussion, and maybe your idea on fake news and how it relates to freedom of press, and and maybe things like defamation as well.
Yeah, again, now these are huge issues. We can have a separate event on this as well. But at the end of the day, the premise is that there has to be space for expression. Freedom of expression is critical. And unfortunately, what we have seen, and I speak from my experience, is different excuses, reasons being used to curtail this expression and modes of expression. If you think about COVID, if you think about war settings, national security is being used, emergencies being used to clamp down. At the same time, the excuse is being used by some that because there's a lot of space and freedom, fake news, misinformation also happens. So there's a tension, there's contradictions as well. It's not straightforward. But at the end of the day, it's a basic fundamental right. And for us, I think what's important for young people, for lawyers, professionals, for media, is to use that right responsibly. And the more you abuse it, the more you strengthen the hand of authorities who can easily use excuses to clamp down. So in a way, how does one respect the right but not misuse it, but being aware that especially in the global south, especially in South Asia, there is a tendency to clamp down on these rights immediately using either security or emergency powers. And then I think very importantly, and I'll end there, is how does one counter them? How does one challenge it? How does one resist it? So again, I can go on for a long time on this, but there's so many dimensions, but it's also thinking through how you maintain the space, but also be responsible in maintaining that space.
Thank you. Katherine, I would love to have your opinion on this subject, as you are working for a magazine, and I'm sure you have a big take on fake news and at the same time protecting the freedom of press.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is something that in the U.S., the way that this discussion has unfolded in recent years is with respect to social media. So the idea that there's a sort of additional power player in this conversation about fake news, which is the big tech companies, and the idea that your speech on Twitter, Facebook, whatever platform you use is now theoretically restricted or in some way governed not only by the state, but also by these corporate players. One thing that's been striking to me is that in the US, there's currently a bizarre thing happening where people on the left and people on the right are both calling for restrictions on the platforms that people increasingly use as their primary mode of speech for different reasons. Conservatives think that they are being censored by the platforms which are largely owned by and dominated by people who don't share their political views, people who are on the left. People on the left, meanwhile, want to restrict hate speech or speech they see as threatening or dangerous. And in general, my view as a libertarian, as a person who doesn't identify with the right or the left, is that when the right and the left agree on a new restriction, it's a very bad time. It's bad news. And I think that's the case here. Journalists, by and large, get a pass in the United States. We have extra protections, even though, interestingly, we also don't have special protections for the press in our Constitution. We just have, we have the notion of speech, we have the idea of speech, and then we have sort of statutory additional protections for journalists. But what does it mean to be a journalist anymore? Who is a journalist? This is a conversation that's been going on for at least a decade, rightly so. There's nothing special about me writing something online versus anyone else writing something online, or there shouldn't be in the eyes of the law. So from my perspective, this kind of conversation about where speech becomes dangerous because it contains misinformation or because it contains bias, I am always going to kind of return to the idea that more voices are our best bet, because if we let someone with power decide who gets to speak and who doesn't, whose speech is misinformation and whose speech is truth, that person will always have their own agenda. They will always have something they want that isn't just the truth. And so we have to maximize the space for speech whenever possible.
Thank you for that. We have a few questions from the audience. There's a question especially for Apoorva. This is, according to you, do you ever in the future see patriarchal supremacy coming to an end in India? I'm not sure how you can answer something like that decisively, but I think your views are required on this. So please go ahead.
I mean, that's such a huge question to ask, and also to even I don't even know where to answer that question. But then, coming from India and also being an actor in Kerala, one of the things that that I see recently, or that I've been seeing for a while, is the fact that there is a sudden surge of moral policing and overt patriarchy, even on social media. And there's been a lot of conversation around this, and people have been discussing, which is great. The fact that we're actually discussing this question, and there's a lot of thoughts and diverse opinions on this. But I think for there to be an end to something as ingrained as patriarchy, there needs to be a complete paradigm shift. Like, for example, when we talk about Cohen's paradigm shift, first there is a thought, and then there is a revolution, and then there is a new thought. So I believe that we're in the state of revolution. Like, it is something as ingrained, as integral as patriarchy. And the fact that we're discussing is the fact that we are open to different ideas. There's the term feminism is no longer alien to people across the world, and people are discussing this, shows that we are in a space of revolution. And maybe one day, we would actually smash patriarchy, and we would actually smash the ceiling that we keep talking about. I'm hopeful, but then I think we are a long way away from it. And yeah, I think we should still fight as hard as we can to smash the patriarchy that we see right now.
Thank you. And we'll have one last question, I think, because we just have about 3 minutes left, which I will address to both Jerry and Ayushi. During COVID, we especially seen sex traffickers, and that includes a huge faction of transgender persons, because they're involved in, not sex trafficking, sex workers in the profession. We've seen that they have taken a major hit, and their economical activities have completely come to a stop. According to you, what sort of policies do we require from the government, especially for sex workers and for transgender persons, just focusing on that that faction of the society, to help them come out of extreme poverty that they have gone into because of the pandemic and a complete loss of jobs. So we can start with Jerry first and then move to Ayushi.
Thank you for unmuting me. See, it's kind of ironic that in a libertarian liberal gathering, you've asked me a question of what the government should do. So let me just step back and actually just say that we can always go to the government to ask for many things, right? Whether it is transgender people or any other kind of diversity segments. The conversation, I don't think, should focus on what we need to ask, but essentially it should be focused on what are we entitled to have. And when you say that what we are entitled to have, you can only finally come down to a few things. And the few things are your human rights, your fundamental individual human rights. So essentially the conversation of decriminalization of homosexuality had to be a legal conversation, because you can't go beyond decriminalization in India if you are already a criminal and you are not allowed to have a civic space in which you can put forth your thought as an equal citizen. Because then you are a criminal, right? A criminal is not supposed to be speaking in society, but in prison. So essentially, what you do with the government is ensure that your rights are guaranteed. And then the rest of the conversation about civic benefits and civic rights and job opportunities and all of those things are negotiations that must happen between stakeholders and between decentralized local communities. And the recent Nalsa judgment was brilliant in that sense. However, the way in which the government has implemented the Nalsa judgment in India, for those of you who don't know, the Supreme Court extended a lot of recognition of fundamental rights to transgender people. But the way in which the government then stepped in, this government, to then define what is a trans person and how would a trans person be legally recognized, that was a imposition pushed through the two chambers of the houses without consultation with the stakeholders involved. And that is where, as liberals and libertarians, we need to get involved and be like, this is not right.
Ayushi, can you just sum it in a minute, please?
Okay, I'll try my best. That's quite a task. But majorly agreeing with what Jerry said, actually, it's in a conversation on human rights. In fact, our appeal begins with everything that the government is doing is wrong. And it's when we talk about vulnerable populations, such as sex workers, the law of India currently doesn't allow them to, for example, solicit publicly, which in effect means that it is illegal to be a prostitute. And even though there has been a lot of conversation about how women do not always choose this work, even though the choice should be open, they are pushed to do it because of the lack of economic avenues for them to lead an independent life or to support their family. The state actually makes it even more difficult and even impossible for them to have a respectful life worthy of dignity. And we can see that in how the government has dealt with migrant workers now, refusing to tell us what the data is and saying that there's there is absolutely no question of any relief to them in terms of compensation for what they have suffered. And so there is clearly not going to be any compensation for even people like sex traffickers who have also suffered because of the economic downturn and people not being on the streets, people not being able to get out of their houses. So I think the conversation begins with the government recognizing vulnerabilities, but that's only the starting point. And there's just so much left to be done in such a long road ahead.
Thank you for that, Ayushi. And now I will hand over the floor to Priya from Isaac for a short promotional thing about Isaac. So, and thank you so much for joining, because I think after this we will not have more time to discuss the very relevant problems that we are facing right now. But this was a very, very interesting and a very required starter of a conversation, because we couldn't get much into it. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Atishya, for that. I'd like to quickly share my screen.